Hey guys, it's Chris with Braille Scale. Happy New Year. Welcome to 2020. New Year, same me. Today we're going to talk about dioramas and vignettes, kind of the differences between the two, and an introduction to some of the more fine art aspects when it comes to creating a diorama. I hope this to be the start of a longer series on how-tos when it comes to diorama building or vignette building, just depending on what you want to do. If you know how to build one, you can pretty much figure out how to build the other. Diorama might be a little more in-depth. You might have more figures and things like that to think about. Composition might be a little more intricate. But essentially, when it comes to groundwork, vegetation, buildings, different things like that, the background, that's going to be the same. So I'm going to talk about 6 different characteristics of composition and design. Those 6 things are line, shape, color, texture, value, and space. Now, these elements of design and fine art and composition and things like that are typically applied to two-dimensional pieces of artwork like paintings and photographs. But when it comes to something with 3 dimensions like scale modeling, either vignettes or dioramas, we can apply those same characteristics of design. We just have to be a little more creative about how we approach it. So real quick, I just want to let you guys know, in my opinion, the difference between a vignette and a diorama when it comes to scale modeling specifically. It really, I think, is more opinion than fact at that point, but you'll see some contests where they'll have specific diorama categories that have a minimum number of figures, or at least certain elements that have to check the block in order to qualify for a diorama according to a contest rule. But in the larger scheme of things, in my opinion, the one thing that separates a diorama from a vignette is a diorama tells a story to the viewer, whereas a vignette is almost like just a frozen snapshot in time. Now, a good example of a vignette might just be this Panzer IV by itself. Even if you throw a track on one side and you have a casualty sitting there in the snow or something like that, you don't really start to tell the whole story. But when you add in some Russian anti-tank gunners, where their tactics included aiming for tracks and trying to disable a vehicle since their anti-tank rifle couldn't actually penetrate the armor, you throw in a propaganda photographer and another 2-man team, you start to get a little bit more of a story about how the tank became disabled, what happened, what these people are doing currently, things like that. So, in my opinion, if you can tell a story with 1 or 2 figures, I know some modelers are really good at telling stories with just the vehicle itself. But if you can do it with 2 or 3 figures, in my mind, that's a diorama. I know I've been to competitions where they require a minimum of 7 figures before they consider it to be a diorama. I don't know if it's really that cut and dry, but I think the story element is what separates that from just simply a vignette that showcases a vehicle with some groundwork, or maybe 1 figure that doesn't really add to the story. Alright, so when we're talking about line, what that means is not simply just straight lines that you portray within that 3-dimensional space of a diorama, or a 2-dimensional space of a painting or a photograph. When we talk about line with respect to elements of design, that is talking about the line that the viewer's eye follows as they go around and view everything within the space of that either 2-dimensional piece of art or 3-dimensional piece of art. I would say developing a line is actually easier with a photograph or a drawing or painting or something like that, because as the artist, you can control the narrative, so to speak. You limit the perspective of that piece to what is shown to them in that 2-dimensional space. Now, with a 3-dimensional vignette or a diorama here, we don't really have any control over how that viewer wishes to view that object. Maybe they see this as the front. That makes sense because the vehicle was driving in that direction. Maybe they think this is the front because you can better see what this mortar team is doing down here in their little dugout. Maybe they, for whatever reason, just find this side more appealing, or this is the first side they happen to see because they came up to the display from the side. I mean, it's a three-dimensional space that can be viewed from all sides, so you can't just control the narrative and do a really good job of putting a lot of visual clues in there to help control the line that the viewer's eye follows. What that means is you have to have things that are interesting from all sides, right? You have to consider this in this three-dimensional space and be able to have multiple objects of interest that help pull the viewer's eye. The more complex that line is and the more it kind of becomes cyclical, the longer that viewer can maintain interest on the subject, and the better the work will be. So while we're talking about line, and the next thing that goes kind of hand in hand is shape. Now when we talk about shape, we're not talking about obvious shapes, but what we're talking about is kind of the shapes that the human mind likes to kind of create on its own. So we have this kind of like a U shape here. We've got a circle kind of right here. This looks like a line, not just because of the side of the T34 here, but just because we have this similar colored dirt right here. This whole section is negative space in a sense, right? And that's something we'll get to here in a minute. But this looks like a triangle. Now you have the actual shape of the T34, which is a rectangle. The turret gives us kind of this odd trapezoidal kind of shape. Again, you've got another line right here. And so the idea with shape kind of goes back to the idea of line, right? As the human eye moves around here, it's going to start classifying things into different shapes. Now, what we want to avoid when it comes to specific works with dioramas and things like that, we want to avoid is having too many shapes appear symmetrical or idealistic, right? So we want to have some chaos in here. So you have the T34 going in one direction, the turret's a second direction, you've got this mortar system facing a third direction. Everything's kind of clashing, right? And it all kind of meets in the middle here. You've got direct lines here, across here, different directions, but it's cyclical. You have kind of some triangular shapes in there, and that's really what you want to achieve is visual points of interest. Again, no matter which way you look at it, you want to achieve some visual kind of triangular shapes that help bring the eye around. For whatever reason, the triangle is something that's aesthetically pleasing. And again, you want to avoid things like squares and rectangles, especially squares and rectangles that are perpendicular to the base. So we already have a square base. If I had the T34, for example, lined up directly with the base in either direction, it would just look a little too perpendicular, a little too perfect, and it just wouldn't quite draw as much interest as it would if you were to kind of throw things off at different angles. Something else that can help draw the viewer's attention when it comes to controlling that line that the viewer sees is color. So you've got this bright green here, you've got bright green here, and you've got bright green here. And again, these three objects kind of create that triangle. This still has some grass, but it doesn't have the same kind of bright green effect. This is going to be a darker area than this, right? You're changing the color, so you're helping to draw some focus right in here. You're helping to break up this groundwork. You've got different colors in the leaves. The mud isn't all the same color, even the green of the tank, right? You've got darker greens, lighter greens. This is where the idea of kind of color modulation comes into play. One thing you want to do when it comes to color is avoid pure colors. And when I mean pure color, I mean pure white or pure black. Neither one really occur naturally. And you'll see the black in here, none of this was actually painted black. That's just pure shadow. That's a real life effect, as opposed to this here, which I was forced to paint. And you can see even between this and this is significantly lighter. It's not a true black. And if I could make it a true black, I'd probably try to, because that really should be just as dark as this. But you don't want to include any kind of true blacks anywhere around here, because it's not really naturally occurring. Even their equipment is going to be more of a gray. The boots are going to be gray. The rubber on the road wheels, that's a gray. So it's just, it's not something that you want to have too much of, because it just creates too much unnatural contrast. And the same thing with the whites. You'll see a lot of people use off-whites, whether it's kind of a warm white or a cool white, a little bit of a reddish brown or a little bit of a bluish with that white, just to help kind of tie things into the overall feel of the diorama and control the extremes to help make things seem a little more realistic. For example, this isn't, as you can see, this isn't pure white. This looks more of like a dirty gray. There's a couple of rust tones and things like that in there. It helps to keep it within the color palette of the rest of the scene. One benefit that we have with scale modeling in 3 dimensions, as opposed to photographers or painters, is when it comes to texture. With texture, you can see these leaves, the grass, the mud, even you can catch it in the light here too, with the oil stains and things like that. You can see there's a little bit of a sheen to the oil stains. It's a lot easier to capture texture in a 3-dimensional work like this, just because you don't have to replicate it. The texture is there. It's not an effect. Unlike a lot of things that we do in scale modeling, the texture is one of the few things where we can actually replicate it. So value and color go hand in hand. Value is almost like how much of a color. So you can do things like adding black to make something darker, adding brown or greens and purples and things like that. It's probably a little better because you get a little more of that vibrant color in there. But you're either darkening or lightening a color. Instead of using a white to lighten a color, you can use things like yellow. The color that's brighter on here has more yellow in it. There's no whites or blacks used to darken or lighten this T34. But the value essentially is what helps create this idea of shadows and depth and intensity of light. And when you get into color modulation, one of the things I like to do, instead of highlighting specific panels and things like that with the color modulation, is I try to think of the light source. And I try to put my lighter colors on top and my darker colors kind of where they would naturally be in shadow anyway. So you've got a lot of darker colors down here around the turret. Right here behind this hatch, you've got brighter colors across the back and the high points, things like that. And you can see it helps kind of pop the gun barrel off of the background in a natural looking way. Lastly, I just want to talk about space, because you can call it positive or negative space, but really there shouldn't be a whole lot of truly negative space, right? Now, if you want to talk specific to objects and subjects, right, here's an object, here's some subjects. The rest of this could be negative space with these positive objects occupying the rest of the space. But even in the negative space, you still want to create some interest with these objects, right? You've got a couple dead trees here. You've got different variations in texture. color, things like that. You've got a lot of leaves here in this negative space, some deadfall that's been stacked up down here in this low point, more color, another object with the dead trees, grasses and textures, different mud texture. You've got the boards and things like that. And they all continue to add little points of interest, little points of highlights and shadows that'll catch the viewer's attention as they go around and observe this. Again, just trying to fill these spaces to the point where no matter which angle someone views this little scene, they're rewarded with some kind of detail. It's not truly empty space, but it might just not have the same level of objects and subjects. But you want to make sure that it's well balanced. You don't want to make it look too symmetrical, even though you've got a triangle here, more or less a triangle here and here. I did my best to kind of break it up a little bit. This has some leaves and a kind of larger tree with lots of branches, greens and yellow grass, smaller tree, less branches, more green and brown, some twigs and things coming out of the side, a little bit of leaves piled up next to the stakes here, with a lot more brown grass on this side, 2 trees instead of 1, a little bit of the green and brown here to get this full 3-tone section. And then you've got just the brown and green, no tree, but a little bit of the twigs and more texture. And you've got more of this kind of runoff erosion effect. A little bit of that here, but not as much as you have over here, because this area is designed to look like it was more man-made, where they actually dug this area out for their mortar pit, as opposed to here, which is more of that kind of natural eroding texture. So just to wrap up, I mean, I think I'm going to have a much better description of all this in the video description below, but and it's just really an introduction into more of the artistic side of creating a composition and how you want to set things up. I mean, you want to avoid symmetry, you want to avoid even numbers typically, because if you've got 4 characters, there's only so many ways you can kind of arrange them without making it look too symmetrical. Yeah, you can do 3 characters over here and 1 character over here, but again, at that point you've almost broken them down into groups with odd numbers, a group of 3, a group of 1, because again, the brain's going to start categorizing things into different shapes, different groups. You want to have balance, but you don't want symmetry, if that makes sense. You want to fill kind of all of those spaces, be it with objects or with textures or with color or with something. You want to have some kind of interest there, no matter where it's viewed, without too much unnatural symmetry, parallel lines, things like that. You want to break it up with a lot of chaos, just because I think at that point you've really captured the viewer's attention. It's not something that makes sense in their brain, so they have to analyze it more. They have to look in there more to be able to find those like symmetrical patterns that the brain likes to see and categorize. So again, check out the description below. I think I'm going to try to put all this into more ordered thoughts and better categorized points I'm trying to make here. But I do plan to do more of these videos on what I think specifically with a diorama, what I think the best approaches are, what works, what doesn't necessarily work as well, and then how to tell a good story, right? Because that's really what I think separates a diorama from a vignette is that storytelling aspect, the human element with the figures. You want to have that viewer be able to look at that diorama and put themselves in it to understand some of the mentalities and the thought processes of the soldiers there, or the airmen next to a plane or whatever it is. Because even with all the tricks with textures and colors and shapes and lines around there that kind of help draw the viewer in, if you can get them engaged into that imagination process of believing that this is a real scene and these are real people and the real stories that inspired this, if you can get them thinking into there, they're always going to remember more of the diorama that way than they would if it was just really well executed from a technical perspective, but just not really engaging. Sometimes I think I have a little bit of an unfair advantage when it comes to the storytelling aspect, just because I do have some military experience, so I feel like I have a better understanding of kind of the everyday mentality. And I think though, if people realize that people in the military are everyday people, that mentality doesn't come from nowhere, right? If you've um, ever had a long, boring day at work and you have to find something to do to occupy your time, that's what a bunch of soldiers are going to do when they're not engaged in direct combat. They're going to be, coming up with different things to occupy their time. So in the next video, I'll get into storytelling, some basic storytelling aspects, how to tell a good story with 3D scale figures and vehicles and things like that, where to get inspiration from, how to do your research to make sure that the story is not just believable from a human perspective, but also believable if you want to put it in an actual historical place and time, how you can capture that. And then as I do a couple more of these how-to videos, I'll get into kind of the basics of building a diorama from a technical aspect with how to do groundwork and different earth effects and vegetation, photographing it with natural backdrops, with different just plain white backdrops, or you take it outside. I mean, you can't just shoot it directly in the sun because the lighting is going to be way too harsh. You have to get some kind of a translucent screen to let the light diffuse before you take the picture. That's it for today. I will see you guys next time. If you are interested in more of this diorama process and getting away from maybe just putting a tank on a little bit of groundwork as a vignette and actually get more storytelling in there, please feel free to continue to check out my videos, subscribe, or if you've got other points to bring up, or if you've read the description below and you've got some more insight or disagree with something I've said, feel free to throw it in the comments and I'll definitely get down there and send some replies and we can discuss. So I hope everyone has a great 2020, and hopefully I will produce a lot more content. Big shout out to my wife, Sarah. Really appreciate all the support, and from Sarah and I to all of you, happy holidays, happy New Year, and here's a great holiday card photo to send you off with.